Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 15. Mike sat at a long metal table in Camp Carson's mess hall, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of hot chocolate. The enormous room, usually bustling with hungry soldiers, was eerily quiet at this hour. The distant clanging of pots and pans gave evidence of the kitchen staff working on the day's final cleanup. Half of the overhead lights remained on. The mess hall was still bright enough to illuminate the institutional green walls and polished linoleum floors. The smell of bleach and the evening's meal of chicken and rice lingered in the air. It had been a hard day for Mike Fiorante. The shock of going to a suspect's home only to find he'd been dead for years. The frustration of being unable to do anything for an abused woman, and the heartbreak of seeing yet another vet in pain were more than enough for one day. Also, he had almost gotten his lights punched out. So, all in all, it had been a rough day. Now he was going to visit with two army pals who had also been in Rome, hoping they might know something that would lead them to Maria Albano's killer. Across from Mike sat Sergeants Hank Kowalski and Lenny Paulson, an unlikely pair that fit together like two sides of a coin. Hank, built like a tank with biceps straining against his sleeves, leaned on the table. His presence commanded attention, even in repose. The hall's lights reflected off his close-cropped blonde hair, accentuating the sharp angles of his face. Lenny, by contrast, lounged in his chair, a crooked grin playing on his lips. His eyes danced with mischief, always ready with a quip to lighten the mood. He twirled a pencil between his fingers, occasionally tapping it against the table, in an erratic rhythm that seemed to match his restless energy. The pronounced difference between the two men was not just in their postures, but in the very air around them. Hank exuded intensity, while Lenny radiated an easygoing charm that could disarm cynics and doubters of all persuasions. Mike inhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the warm mug. He looked at the two trusted sergeants.
I want to pick your brains.
He was friendly, but serious. Hank, his interest piqued, edged in closer, his muscular frame casting a shadow across the table.
Sure, Captain. What's on your mind?
Lenny changed gears, setting down his pencil and giving Mike his full attention. Mike's eyes shifted between them.
There have been 3 murders in Los Angeles. We think they're connected to something that happened in Rome. A murder.
At the mention of Rome, both men's postures changed. Hank's eyes narrowed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Lenny sat up straighter, his usual grin replaced by a hard stare.
There's a good chance.
Weighing his words with precision.
We think one of ours is responsible for all 4 murders. Not necessarily Army, but someone in the services. Dan Kelly and I are working with the Los Angeles police. So far, we've chased down about 10 former servicemen who were in Rome. All had violent incidents or serious problems in Rome. So far, none of them appears to be the murderer.
As Mike's words registered with Hank and Lenny, he noticed their serious expressions. The sound of a door slamming in the kitchen ended the silence. Mike's usual confidence had unexpectedly faltered. He'd faced down enemy fire with these men, but now he struggled to find the right words. His eyes darted between Hank and Lenny, searching for a way to broach the subject delicately. As Mike spoke, it was clear he didn't know how to proceed.
You both ran with different crowds back in Rome. Different from mine.
Hank was struggling to get Mike's point.
Officers and non-coms.
He scratched his head, missing Mike's meaning. Lenny, however, caught on in a heartbeat. A knowing smile appeared as he sat back in his chair.
He means the women,
Lenny said, his tone matter-of-fact.
He's talking about the whores, Hank.
Mike relaxed just a bit, grateful for Lenny's bluntness.
Yes,
he admitted, shrugging his shoulders.
Since the victim in Rome was a whore, I thought you might know. Heard of someone who might have hurt?
Before Mike could finish his sentence, Hank's eyes widened with understanding. He leaned forward,
Is this about Maria?
his voice rising in intensity. Mike's eyes went wide in surprise. He hadn't expected Hank to jump ahead of him.
Maria Albano? Yes.
Lenny grinned as he got ready to listen to his friend wax nostalgic. He moved closer to Mike, cupping his hands around his mouth as if sharing a secret.
They were intimately acquainted.
His fingers making exaggerated air quotes around the word intimately. A burst of laughter erupted from Lenny. The thought that either Lenny or Hank might have been one of Maria Albano's Johns had never crossed Mike's mind. He took a deep breath, composing himself.
Ah,
Mike said, starting in again.
well, it looks like the guy who killed her has killed 3 more.
It's a crime.
Hank said loudly. Mike looked back at Hank solemnly.
Yes, of course it was.
Mike said, confused. But Hank wasn't finished. His face was red, his hands and fists on the table.
Oh, yeah, sure. But that's not what I meant.
Growing more sentimental with each word.
Maria was the best.
Look out. Get ready.
Lenny said, barely containing his delight. He winked at Mike, then slouched back in his chair, crossing his arms.
Here it comes.
Hank, oblivious to Mike's confusion, plowed on, his eyes glazed over, lost in memory.
When it came to blowjobs, she was the queen.
And there you have it.
Said Lenny while shaking his head. His grin widened at the captain's growing unease. Mike squirmed in his seat. He'd expected a serious conversation about potential suspects. Not this. Lenny's eyes sparkled, his lips quivering as he fought to keep from laughing. Mike cleared his throat, desperately searching for a way to steer the discussion back to safer ground. He opened his mouth to speak, but Hank wasn't finished.
Never had anything like Maria.
Hank said respectfully.
The woman could have won prizes.
Mike turned to Lenny, hoping for a way out. But Lenny was too busy trying to keep a straight face. Catching Mike's desperate look, Lenny composed himself enough to offer an explanation.
I've been hearing about Maria and her magic mouth for years.
He said, clearly amused. While Mike's unease mounted, a hazy, wistful look came over Hank as he thought about Maria Albano. The big soldier spoke as if he were discussing a famous artist.
Guys would fight over dates with her. She charged more than any other girl. Nobody beefed.
Lenny was beaming, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. He seemed to be thoroughly enjoying Mike's predicament. Hank sighed, staring at some distant point.
She was amazing. The guy who put an end to that?
He shook his head. His expression conveyed deep regret.
A crime. Like I said.
Mike swallowed hard, desperate to talk about possible suspects. But before he could speak, Hank launched into another colorful anecdote about Maria's skills, leaving Mike to wonder how he'd lost control of the conversation so spectacularly. Mike cleared his throat again.
Can you think of anyone who might have had a problem with her?
Mike asked, his voice strained. Hank's eyes widened in disbelief.
That would kill that piece of ass from heaven? No, you'd have to be out of your mind.
He shook his head decisively.
I can think of a bunch of guys who might kill you if you jump the line with her.
Mike's forehead wrinkled. He was dubious. Tales of working girls had crossed his path before, but such intense loyalty struck him as odd. Hank caught the look of disbelief and was determined to make his point.
Oh yeah,
Hank exclaimed, slapping his hand on the table, causing coffee spoons to rattle.
you don't believe me? Let me tell you something, Captain.
Lenny got comfortable, settling in for what was clearly a well-known rant. Mike braced himself, realizing he was in for another round of Hank's colorful reminiscing. A chagrined Mike listened as Hank's heartfelt tale about Maria Albano finally wound down. Just as Mike thought he might be able to get the talk back on track, Hank's face hardened. He had more to say and fixed on Mike with an intense stare.
See? Women here don't know. How they gonna fucking learn?
Mike opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Hank, sensing his bewilderment, added clarification.
I got a girl, you know? Pretty.
Hank's voice turned soft as he made the gesture of kissing his fingertips and then opening up his hand. It was a very Italian thing to do. Mike thought Hank had probably picked it up in Rome.
Sweet. Looks like that girl in It's a Wonderful Life.
He snapped his fingers repeatedly, trying to recall.
Donna Reed.
Mike said, knowing he was going to regret it.
Bingo. That's it. Donna Reed. Hell, she even makes a hell of a pecan pie.
Hank's expression darkened.
But in the sack? No goddamn idea.
Hank's frustration was clear. He threw his hands up in exasperation.
What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? You fuck like a dead fish.
Mike looked to the ceiling, silently praying for some kind of divine intervention to end this. But Hank was far from finished.
She grew up watching Andy Hardy movies. That's her idea of romance. Can you tell me how a woman who grew up watching Andy Hardy is going to know what to do in bed?
Mike shifted anxiously, remembering a night in Italy when his platoon had watched an Andy Hardy movie projected onto a tent wall.
Kay, darling.
Hello, Andrew. Welcome back to Wainwright.
Why, you look better than I ever thought you'd look, and I thought you'd look sensational.
Well, you haven't run downhill yourself.
What are you doing for the whole rest of the year? I figure if we have about 5 or 6 dates a week in about 3 years, we'll be back on schedule.
Despite the distant sound of artillery fire, the soldiers had laughed and cheered as Andy Hardy stumbled through his latest teenage crisis. The movies had been everywhere during the 40s, more than a dozen of them chronicling Andy's wholesome adventures through high school, first cars, and prom dates. Mickey Rooney's portrayal of the earnest teenager forever seeking his father's help made him America's biggest box office draw for 2 years running. Mike could still see the men, momentarily transported back home by Andy's innocent mishaps, forgetting the war for a precious few hours. But now, listening to Hank's crude comparison, his memories of Andy Hardy were somehow tainted. It started with Donna Reed, then on to Mickey Rooney. Somehow, Andy Hardy, the title character in a series of fondly remembered movies about a small-town, all-American boy comically struggling through his teenage years, got shoved into the middle of a discussion of the poor quality of the love-making techniques of American women, or at least those known by Sergeant Hank Kowalski. Mike glanced at Lenny, but the relief he hoped for showed no signs of arriving anytime soon. Lenny chimed in, his eyes sparkling.
You think this is crazy? The woman gave him the clap, and he still goes on about her.
Then, for emphasis,
It's true.
Mike looked at Hank, wondering how this could be possible.
Yeah, it's true.
Hank admitted.
God, that girl knew how to use her mouth.
Mike winced, but Hank was already off in another direction,
The last time I saw Maria.
his voice taking on a reverent tone.
The very last time. I was at the doctor to get the cure.
For the first time, Hank showed the tiniest bit of embarrassment. He explained that the doctor's office was a temporary setup in a vacant store just blocks from his billet.
No real hard walls. There were only curtains separating the examining rooms. Everybody had to keep their voices down. I'm in the waiting room, and there's this yelling going on behind one of the curtains.
Beh, prenditi la tua maledetta cura e ficcatela su Your Fat White American Ass.
Wild. Like I said, everyone whispered because of the walls, but it was so loud it wouldn't have made a difference if the walls were a foot thick.
He said, chuckling.
Te lo ripeto ancora una volta. Ficcatela bene, fino in fondo, e magari soffoca pure con quella merda
Hank's
di
smile
medicina.
grew as he recounted the tale, his energy up.
My Italian is not great, screaming like you never heard, a woman yelling and cursing in Italian.
Cura miracolosa, che dovrei fare? Che cazzo dovrei fare? Mangiare aria? Bere lacrime? Vendi
I
sogni
could
da
make
due
out
soldi?
some of it.
He shook his hand as if he'd burned his fingers on a hot stove, mouthing, "Ow!" dramatically.
E tu, con la tua faccia di porco, pensi che io lasci andare via i miei soldi così? Che io dica,
Mike found himself leaning forward, drawn into Hank's animated storytelling despite his better judgment.
va bene, e me ne vada col sorriso? Fuck you!
There was some English.
Hank said, his grin widening.
Levati the fuck dalla mia strada, stronza inutile. Non ti azzardare a
Fuck
guardare...
you, fuck this. But most was Italian. It was crazy. Then a curtain flies open, and Maria storms out,
No, non lo farò. Non lo farò mai.
angry, shaking, and still cursing in Italian.
Nasty cunt. Vuoi comandarmi? Vuoi strapparmi la vita dalle mani? Non hai idea con chi cazzo hai a che fare. Io non mi piego.
Hank's
non mi
hands
spezzo,
flew up,
non sono
mimicking
una
Maria's
piccola
explosive
pecorella.
exit.
Fammi uscire subito
Never
da
saw
questo
me,
buco di merda.
just stormed out,
Respirare l'aria di fuori. Questo posto puzza di morte.
smoke coming out of her ears.
Mike couldn't help but picture the scene. The fiery Italian prostitute, her face contorted with rage, burst out of the doctor's office. He knew he was hooked, waiting for the punchline he knew was coming. Hank's eyes glistened with anticipation.
And this is the best part. About 2 seconds later, this old nurse comes out from the same room, red as a beet.
He glanced at Lenny, who was familiar with the story's end.
I don't think the old girl ever heard swearing like that.
Hank added, shaking his head.
Right after that, the doc comes out, eyes the size of saucers, trying to look calm.
Hank tried to recreate the doctor's shocked expression.
And everybody, the nurse, the doc, me, the others in the waiting room, pretended nothing happened. We could have been in church.
Hank roared with laughter, his voice booming through the mess hall. Mike smiled back at Hank, but he honestly didn't find the story that funny. Lenny, on the other hand, who'd heard the story before, was wiping tears from his eyes. As the laughter died down, Hank's eyes softened.
That was the last time I saw her.
His voice trailing off. Each of them retreated into silence. The tale finished, their minds wandered. Mike took a sip of his now lukewarm hot chocolate. He glanced at Hank, noting the faraway look in the sergeant's eyes. Lenny, too, seemed subdued, his earlier amusement fading. They sat together for a moment. Then, almost as an afterthought, Hank muttered under his breath,
Fucking Andy Hardy.
Chapter 16. William Young perched on the edge of his narrow bed, his eyes surveying the dim confines of his studio apartment. The fact that he had to share a bathroom down the hall and the modest furnishings of his apartment were of little consequence to him. The peeling wallpaper and scuffed floorboards whispered of neglect. But William was unconcerned. His focus was internal, his mind repeating the comforting words of Scripture he held close to his heart.
Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you."
He ran a hand through his long black hair, feeling the coarse strands between his fingers. His worn face bore the lines of a man who had seen both hardship and joy. Each wrinkle earned in a life given to service. William's clothes were simple and well worn, much like the room around him, but his eyes sparkled with an inner fire that contradicted his humble surroundings. He stood and moved to the small window overlooking the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles, now in the dark. A warmth surged through William, straightening his shoulders and lifting his chin with refreshed purpose. What mattered was his mission, to save souls, and there were so many to save. With each person he helped and each life he touched, William moved closer to fulfilling his divine calling. He knew his path was not an easy one, but he was prepared to face whatever obstacles came his way, secure in the knowledge that he was never truly alone. 40 minutes later, near a busy intersection, William honed his look as he took in the street. His eyes darted nervously behind his round glasses, taking in the sights and sounds of the night. He clutched his precious Bible tightly against his chest, drawing strength from its familiar weight. At the corner, 3 young women loitered in provocative outfits, their eyes searching for dates. The first was a tall blonde with red lipstick. She was resting casually on a mailbox. Her short skirt and low-cut top worked like a billboard. Next to her stood a petite Asian woman, her dark eyes heavily lined with kohl, fidgeting with the strap of her sequined dress. The third woman, with shiny jet-black hair and pale skin, paced back and forth in impossibly high heels, her fishnet stockings making a crisscross pattern on her legs. William inhaled sharply, steadying himself before stepping forward, his heart hammering. As he reached the group, he introduced himself.
Hello, I'm William Young. I'd like to talk to you about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Heed these words from Isaiah.
The women looked at him with confusion, their eyes puzzled. Then an amused look broke across the blonde's face.
Hey, I've heard of you. Your Bible Bill.
She exclaimed. The other 2 women's expressions changed as they also recognized the name. What followed was not what William had hoped for. Instead of welcoming his message with open hearts and minds, the women began to tease him mercilessly, their jeers cutting him like shards of glass. They poked fun at his appearance, mocking his disheveled clothing and thick glasses, and made light of his earnest efforts to save their souls. Their words stung William deeply, each jab feeling like a personal affront to his mission. The woman with the black hair made up obscene scripture in a voice that made the other 2 laugh. William's face grew hot with embarrassment and exasperation, his hands clenching involuntarily at his sides. He got angry. He opened his mouth to speak again, to try and redirect their attention to his message. But the women were not interested. Finally, with a dismissive wave of manicured hands and a chorus of insults, they turned their backs on him. William stood there for a moment, deflated and uncertain, watching their attention return to passing cars and potential dates. He felt an ache in his chest, sorrow for their lost souls and disappointment in his own inability to reach them. As William walked away, he acknowledged his failure to himself. It was not the first time the words of the good book had fallen on deaf ears, nor would it be the last. He was split right down the middle between frustration and a growing sense of anger.
Why won't these women listen to me? They are on the course to eternal damnation. What must I do?
He reminded himself that God gave him power, and this setback was just another test of his faith. 45 minutes later, as the moon rose over the ocean, William approached a lone streetwalker in a tiny park near Quincy's Liquors. She was petite, in her early 20s, with a striking figure and a blonde wig, though her heavy makeup made her appear much older. To begin her pitch, she said,
"Hey, stud, I'm Trixie. Maybe I can show you a trick or 2.
Then the young prostitute took a good look at William and knew he was about something else entirely. He began his standard speech about salvation.
Hello, I'm William Young.
Her initial reaction was annoyance, but then something changed in her demeanor. She raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence.
Your Bible Bill, aren't you?"
William hesitated, then reluctantly accepted the nickname he'd grown to dislike. The girl's eyes softened, conveying an unexpected warmth.
"I have a brother like you. His name is Danny.
taking on an intimate tone.
Haven't seen him in a long time.
Her words trailed off. For a brief moment, she was in her parents' living room with Danny. Jack Benny was on the radio as they tossed couch cushions at each other and giggled. She turned back to William. A small smile played on her lips as she continued.
Was always Jesus this and Jesus that. We must pray for the sinners,
she said. It was affectionate, not mean-spirited. William stood mute, surprised by the sudden intimacy of their conversation. He wasn't sure how to proceed. As sweet as the memory of home had been for Trixie, the truth was that she was here, right now, and she could never go home. She looked at Bible Bill directly. She was firm but not unkind.
Listen, William, nobody wants to hear what you got in that book. Go home.
William was confused by her manner, which conflicted with what she said. When William didn't move, her words became harsh.
Leave me the fuck alone.
Taken aback by the abrupt change and dismayed at her forceful rejection, William found himself at a loss for words. He turned and walked away in silence. While angry that she had not heard him, there was something there. A connection. Maybe he could build on that to help her find God's words the next time. 2 hours later, William's heart raced as he approached a trio of women loitering outside the Seven Seas Motel, their figures silhouetted against the blinking vacancy sign. The neon lights cast an eerie glow on their made-up faces, accentuating the slinky clothes and bright lipstick. As he drew nearer, William could see the women's revealing attire in the dim light. They were clear invitations to sin. One stood vigil near a parking meter, golden tresses spilling down her exposed shoulders. Another paced back and forth, her shimmering thigh-high boots catching in the headlights. He knew these women were lost souls, trapped in a world of sin and despair, and it was his sacred duty to offer them the path to salvation. With a silent prayer for strength, he approached the group, his heart pounding. William Young's grip tightened around his Bible, his knuckles turning white from the intensity. He could feel the weight of his mission pressing down on him, an urgency that burned like a fire in his heart.
Sisters, heed these words from Proverbs. For a prostitute is a deep pit. An adulteress is a narrow well. She lies in wait like a robber and increases the traitors among mankind.
The women turned to look at him with expressions of amusement and aggravation that William had seen before. A tall, willowy black woman with gold bracelets and a large gold necklace let out a scornful snort, her red painted lips curling into a smirk as she sized up the scrawny preacher man. A few strands of her meticulously teased hair fell across her face. She made no move to brush them away, instead fixing William with a challenging stare, one perfectly arched eyebrow raised in mocking skepticism.
Well, well, look what we have here.
As she spoke, her voice oozed with sarcasm.
A regular Bible thumper come to save our souls, glory be.
She raised her palms in the air, her bracelets rattling, as if she were back in church responding to the minister's call. William's face flushed, his hands shaking as he raised his Bible higher, as if the mere sight of the sacred book would be enough to penetrate their hardened hearts.
Sisters, please.
His voice rising in desperation.
Turn away from this path of sin and darkness. Embrace the light of our Lord and Savior.
The women exchanged glances, their eyes rolling in unison. A short blonde with wide hips turned to William with a scornful grin.
Hey, mister.
She said loudly, her tone laced with insult.
You selling something? Because we ain't buying.
The other two erupted into raucous laughter, their jeers and taunts piercing William's heart like sharpened daggers. He stood there, frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He turned, seething with anger. He clenched his Bible tighter. They would listen, one way or another. They couldn't continue to reject God's words and ignore his messenger. Next time, they would see the truth of their sins by the spilling of blood in the name of Jesus Christ. Chapter 17. Day 3. Dan's car moved along the darkened roads, his head churning with ghosts and unanswered questions. The Los Angeles murders lurked in his thoughts, a sinister presence that ebbed and flowed like the tides. It was as if the past and present had collided, blurring the lines between what was and what is. Maria Albano's face, forever burned in his memory, resurfaced. Those lifeless eyes, once vibrant and alluring, stared back at him from 4 years ago, a haunting reminder of all the horrors he had seen in Italy. 3 restless hours of sleep had left him raw, his body refusing to surrender to exhaustion. Since 1:30 a.m., he had not slept. Now, he was on the road to Camp Carson. His headlights lit up the twisting path ahead of him, like the circular thoughts he couldn't escape. What drove this murderer? Why kill this way? What was behind it all? When the gate of Camp Carson appeared in the distance, Dan glanced at his dashboard clock, its luminous hands pointing accusingly to 4:30. His tired eyes took in the base's surroundings, remembering how it had felt to live every day by a soldier's routine. He stopped at the gate. A young guard walked toward his car, puzzled by a civilian arriving at such an early hour. The soldier started to ask Dan why he was there, but before he could answer, a corporal who knew Dan intervened.
"Hello, Major Kelly. Nice to see you."
Dan managed a weary smile.
"Nice to see you, Terry. And it's just Dan Kelly now."
After a brief chat, Dan made a request.
"Corporal Bronsky, could you please ask someone to wake up Mike Fiorante? Ask him to meet me in the mess hall."
As Terry nodded and reached for a phone, Dan drove through the gate. He knew it would be a long day ahead, but he was determined to get some answers. Driving through the base, the steadying calm of the surroundings gave Dan solace. Being here was like stepping back into a piece of himself that had been waiting, off to one side, to be called on again. He'd known camaraderie here, and the weight of the case became a little lighter just knowing a good friend, Mike, would help him shoulder it. He parked in front of the mess hall and climbed out, pausing to take in the crisp pre-dawn air. The standard smells of diesel fuel, freshly cut grass, and engine oil were comforting. At this hour, the stillness was broken only by the distant call of a bird, heralding the coming dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten. A faint glow on the eastern horizon promised the arrival of a new day. He walked into the vast dining hall, appreciating the warmth that greeted him after the cool night air. He looked over the big room with its long rows of tables. A handful of soldiers were scattered throughout. The kitchen staff bustled behind the serving counter, already preparing for the morning rush. Dan made his way to the coffee station, grabbing a steaming cup before picking a table against the wall. As he settled into his seat, Dan got some odd looks from a few soldiers, and it wasn't long before an old face approached.
"Major Kelly, what brings you here so early? I haven't seen you since Rome."
Dan smiled despite his lack of sleep.
"It's just Dan now, Corporal Sikorsky, and I'm here on some business with Captain Fiorante."
Dan's smile softened as a flood of memories washed over him. Italy, the streets of Rome, the long days spent working with the Carabinieri, the ancient city picking itself up after war. For a moment, he was back there, standing on those old streets with allies and friends by his side, united by a powerful purpose. He was surprised by how much seeing a face from Rome affected him. The news of Dan's presence spread through the mess hall. Soon, a stream of soldiers visited his table, each eager to greet him and share a few words. The reverence in their voices was unmistakable, and Dan was touched by their affection.
Dan,
a PFC said,
I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did for us in Italy.
With a sweet smile, he added,
You saved our bacon.
Dan answered humbly, a little uneasy with the praise.
We all did our part. I'm just glad we made it home.
He was kind and generous with each soldier, even as memories of war and peace, past and present, blurred together. He remembered the comrades he'd lost, and disturbingly, Maria Albano's face, fixed in death. Dan looked up and saw Mike, accompanied by Lenny Paulson, who was Dan's first sergeant at Monte Cassino. There was a look of amusement, as there usually was, on Lenny's face. He and Mike approached the small group gathered around Dan.
How many autographs have you signed, Kelly?
Lenny asked with a grin. Dan chuckled as the soldiers around him laughed and began to disperse, each offering a respectful nod as they went. Mike and Lenny stopped to get coffees before joining Dan at the table. Sitting down, Mike spoke.
I read Lenny and Hank in on the LA killings last night. It would be helpful to have Lenny join us. He's got a perspective that could be valuable.
Dan appreciated Lenny's sharp mind. Reaching out a hand, he grasped Lenny's firmly.
Great to see you, Lenny.
There was pleasure in his voice.
We need all the help we can get. You know, I always believed you'd make a good officer.
Well, that makes one of us.
Dan always enjoyed Lenny's humor.
And Hank?
Mike caught Lenny rolling his eyes, but he was not going to go anywhere near Hank Kowalski's ideas about Maria Albano.
His take on things is a little different. Turns out he was one of Maria Albano's regulars.
Dan was surprised by this bit of information.
Anything there?
Not really, not of any value. He did see Maria a few days before her murder. She was throwing a fit at a doctor's office.
As they sat there, the sounds of the mess hall began to fade away. A flicker of optimism stirred in Dan. With both Mike and Lenny's help, perhaps they could start to unravel the questions that had kept him awake. Dan looked at Mike and Lenny, unsure of how much information had been shared. Sensing his hesitation, Lenny flashed a broad smile.
Go ahead, detective. If I get lost, I'll let you know.
Grateful for Lenny's easygoing attitude, Dan took a deep breath, organizing his approach before diving in.
All right, here's the basics. We have 4 dead prostitutes. Maria Albano in Rome 4 years ago, and now 3 more in LA, all killed in the last 4 months. All had their uteruses cut out after death. We in the LAPD believe it's the work of the same man.
Stroking his chin, Lenny indicated he was up to speed.
4 things keep me awake at night,
Dan muttered, rubbing his temples. He checked both men, seeking their leave to proceed. Seeing no objections, he posed the first question.
Why target prostitutes?
Lenny was the first to speak.
They're isolated, outcasts from society. They work on the fringes, and nobody's keeping track of them. It's easier to target them without drawing too much attention. Easy pickings.
Mike knew Lenny was right.
The LAPD detective we're working with, Thacker, said nobody cares about a dead hooker. And as much as I hate to agree, he's right.
Dan tightened his grip on his coffee cup, a surge of bitterness welling up.
So, they're killed because they're dispensable, because this killer sees them as somehow less than human, less worthy.
Lenny shook his head.
Could be. Or maybe it's more personal. Some kind of hatred or disgust aimed specifically at women like them, or at women in general. And these are easy targets.
Dan took a sip of his now tepid coffee. As if planned, The aroma of freshly baked cinnamon rolls arrived at their table, a second ahead of a mess worker in a crisp white apron. He carried a tray piled high with gooey treats and a pitcher of hot coffee.
Fresh out of the oven,
he announced with a smile. All three welcomed the distraction and the energy boost. Lenny's eyes widened at the sight.
Never get service like this. Geez, Dan Kelly, you need to come for breakfast more often.
The three men chuckled, and Dan thanked the cook, appreciative of the gesture. As they dug into the soft, warm rolls, Dan returned to the case. He swallowed a bite and posed his second question.
Why take the uterus?
The uterus is symbolic. It's at the core of what makes them women, the capacity to bear life. Maybe to this killer, it represents something he despises or fears. Taking it away might be his way of erasing what he hates.
There's more to it than just anatomy, I think. The uterus, throughout history, was a symbol of womanhood and fertility. Some cultures revered it, others feared it. The Greeks believed it controlled a woman's emotions. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus. They thought a troubled woman had problems with her hystera, womb.
Both Mike and Dan turned to look at Lenny, surprised by his knowledge.
Didn't expect you to get into the beliefs of ancient cultures, Lenny.
The sergeant's face visibly reddened. Lenny shrugged, a sheepish grin spreading across his face.
What? Okay. After Mike talked to Hank and me about the LA murders, I got curious. Got the key to the library.
Lenny, that's outstanding.
Feeling his oats, Lenny offered another idea.
Or it could be about power. Taking away their ability to reproduce, to create life, is the ultimate form of control.
Speaking with growing confidence, Dan could see the sergeant was in his element. The concept of power and control made sense to Dan, fitting with what he understood. Mike had an ugly thought.
It could also be a sick form of collection. I've heard that some killers take trophies from their victims. Maybe the uteruses serve that purpose for our guy.
A chill ran down Dan's spine as Mike's words sunk in. The notion of someone collecting human organs as trophies was deeply disturbing. Yet he knew it wasn't without precedent. He took a sip of his refreshed hot coffee.
All of these are possible, and they're not mutually exclusive. The killer could be driven by a combination of these motives.
He addressed another issue.
There's also the question of how.
Dan said, his brow arched.
The precision required. It suggests medical training, doesn't it?
You're right. We could be looking at someone with surgical skills. A doctor, maybe? A medic? Or someone who works in a hospital? The Army Hospital in Rome?
Do we actually know how much skill it takes to remove a womb?
Lenny continued, his voice hesitant but determined.
I don't want to make light of this, but everybody dissects frogs in biology class.
It was a question. Lenny, catching an odd look from Mike, backtracked.
Okay, not a good example, but you get my point.
Dan mulled over Lenny's words. As strange as the comparison was, there was some logic to it. They couldn't assume the killer had medical training.
Good call, Lenny. We might need the LAPD to bring in someone who can give us an idea of the skill required here. It might help narrow down suspects.
Seeing agreement from the other two, Dan moved on.
My third question. Why did more than 3.5 years go by between Maria Albano's murder in Rome and the killings in Los Angeles?
Mike and Lenny exchanged glances and shrugs. None of them had a solid answer. The three men began to brainstorm, tossing out ideas rapid fire. A trigger event, perhaps? Or maybe the killer had been elsewhere on a different deployment? Could he have been a sailor at sea? Lenny leaned back in his chair.
Or maybe he kept killing somewhere else, in a place with no law. A place where women like these disappear, and no one cares enough to investigate.
And even if the local authorities did investigate on the other side of the world, how would we know about it?
Dan couldn't shake the troubling thought of the killer continuing his gruesome work in distant lands, undetected and unchallenged. It was a grim possibility, but one they had no means of following up on. Shaking off the dark notion, he steered the conversation back to the subject of a trigger event.
Let's assume that he's been in the U.S. the whole time. What changed? What set him off after all this time?
Mike leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table.
It could be anything. A personal loss, a job change, a move to a new city, something that disrupted his life and pushed him over the edge.
Lenny nodded, his eyes narrowed.
Or maybe he had an encounter with a prostitute that went wrong. Something that triggered a rage inside him, a need for revenge.
After a moment, Lenny gave voice to the conclusion that had been working its way through each of them.
Figure out why the gap in time, and you're halfway to finding him.
Dan moved on to his fourth and final question.
Our murderer seems to have no problems killing, right? And he uses a knife. But he kills them with an injection and then cuts their bodies. Why? I mean, why not start with the gutting?
He knew it was a horrible question to ask. Lenny was the first to respond.
That could be messy.
It was both a statement and a question.
Cutting into a living body would send blood everywhere. Maybe he's trying to avoid that.
Dan pictured all the blood in Maria Albano's apartment. Mike raised something that seemed to contradict itself.
Maybe he doesn't like causing pain,
he said with hesitation.
He's compelled to kill. Needs to, but doesn't want to hurt them?
Lenny reacted to Mike's suggestion.
That's one strange guy you're describing. I think it's just easier to take the uteruses after they're dead. Also, he kills at motels. He does not want to draw attention. Killing them without making any noise is safe. A knife? Well, likely not.
Dan believed a killer concerned about causing pain was paradoxical. Yet he couldn't dismiss it. Lenny's practical explanation also made sense. These were all good ideas, and the lack of specific answers did not matter to Dan Kelly right now. He knew that because he had shared his thoughts, he'd be able to loosen his grip on them. He and Mike could now focus on the day's interviews. Dan pushed back from the table and realized the mess hall was filling up around them, soldiers lining up for breakfast. The hum of conversation, the clink of trays and cutlery, it was all too familiar. Despite his exhaustion, Dan felt calm settle over him. Being here, discussing the case with trusted friends, had rekindled something inside him, a purpose, a reminder of the values he'd held so strongly back then that still drove him now. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready. He had to be. It had been a treat to see Lenny again and get his input. He spent so much time clowning and making jokes that it was easy to forget what a quick mind Sergeant Lenny Paulson had. Dan was certain about one thing. Lenny would make a great officer. The drive to Camp Carson, while costing him any chance of sleep, had been worth it. Dan had no way of knowing that later that morning at Kate's diner, his niece, Allie, would seek answers of her own about her family's past. There, in the quiet lull between breakfast and lunch, she would find an unexpected confidant in Father Ted. Allie would discover truths about the war, her parents, and her uncle. that would put everything in a different light. Chapter 18. By mid-morning, Father Ted had settled into his usual booth at Kate's diner, nursing a lukewarm coffee. He watched as Kate's daughter, Allison, walked toward him, coffee pot in hand and limping. The priest inquired about her injury. Allison explained she had landed wrong in a basketball game against Newport Beach and twisted her ankle. And since the rest of her class had gone for a nature walk, she was helping out at the diner. Even after refilling his coffee, Allison lingered, shifting her weight as if bracing for something. 20 years in the priesthood had taught Ted to recognize when somebody wanted to talk. He waited. There was a change in Allison's stance. Her face grew serious, and then she asked,
"Father, can you talk to me about the war? Mom and Uncle Dan won't."
Ted, sensing the importance of the question, asked her to sit. She scooted into the booth and put her elbows on the table. The palms of her hands formed a gentle rest for her chin. The priest would take it a step at a time. He needed to gauge her responses to what he was going to say.
Allison, what do you know about the war?
Allison began recounting the facts she knew, listing off major events like Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the Nazi death camps. She mentioned the London air raids and the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, adding that she was just a kid at the beginning of the war and couldn't remember much. As Ted listened, a touch of sadness crossed Allie's face. She paused for a moment before adding in a whisper,
"My dad died at Peleliu. I remember that."
Ted's heart ached for the young girl. He realized that behind her question lay a need to understand her family's history. He prepared to navigate this sensitive conversation. He could see curiosity and apprehension in her expression as she waited for his response.
Well, your Uncle Dan served in Sicily and Italy.
Allie was excited and happy that she was finally going to know more. She knew the basics of his war years, but not much else. Her eyes were sharp with interest.
Do you know about the Battle of Monte Cassino?
She shook her head and shrugged. Ted took a deep breath, his mind traveling back to those dark days. He began to paint a picture of the battle for the girl.
Italy is a peninsula shaped like a long leg.
Allie knew this.
The Allies fought their way up the Italian peninsula in the fall of 1943, pushing the Germans north. There's a mountain range, the Apennines, that runs down the middle of the leg. Monte Cassino is in the Apennines, about 80 miles southeast of Rome. The battle was centered around Monte Cassino Abbey, on top of a mountain that stood between the Allies and Rome. The Battle of Monte Cassino was one of the toughest and longest fights of the war. It lasted from January to May of 1944. Your Uncle Dan was there for all of it. The Allied forces had to fight their way up this hill against the Germans, who were dug in.
He paused, making sure Allison was following along.
Imagine trying to climb the steepest hill you've ever seen, while someone at the top throws boulders down at you.
Seeing that Allison was still with him, the priest smiled warmly and went on.
The weather was awful, Allison. Rain turned everything into mud in the winter, making it hard for our boys to move. When spring came, fog rolled in, which made it tough for our planes to help.
He shook his head as he sifted through his memories.
Every day for months, our soldiers woke up knowing they would be sent up the hill again. And when they did, there was a good chance they would get killed.
He stopped and looked at the girl.
That weighs on you, Allison, like a millstone around your neck.
He looked at her, hoping she understood.
The fighting went on and on. one point, the old abbey was bombed, but that just gave the Germans more places to hide. They climbed that hill 4 times. When it was over, both sides had lost a lot of men. The Germans had 20,000 dead and wounded. Allied casualties were almost 3 times higher. It was a very dear price to pay.
Ali was stunned. She could not conceive of so many men dying.
A month after it was over, the Americans were in Rome.
But something else Father Ted said caught her attention.
You said our boys?
Father Ted was pleased Allison had picked up on that.
Like I said, Dan was there for all of it. He met Mike Fiorante there. It was Mike's first combat. And I was there.
But you're a priest.
Ali exclaimed. Ali took a keen interest as Ted revealed his role in the war. He told her he had been a chaplain, a man of the cloth who offered spiritual guidance to soldiers. He served with the Polish Second Corps. In the summer of 1939, Father Ted had been in England studying at Oxford. Then, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, causing England and France to declare war on Germany 2 days later. The war in Europe had started. Germany introduced a new way of fighting. They called it Blitzkrieg, which meant lightning war. Tremendous devastation. Germany and Russia, working together, overran Poland in just 5 weeks. The big priest's eyes grew softer as he spoke of the many Poles who died. Other Poles who had been deported to Russia at the beginning of the war, when Germany and Russia were on the same side, were set free when Germany attacked Russia. Now, the Poles and the Russians were on the same side, along with the British and the Americans. These Poles were sent to Iran, where they formed the Polish Second Corps under the British. The Poles got back into the fight against the Germans in Italy.
I joined them in Italy.
He told the bright-eyed girl that, in addition to Americans, there were men from Britain, Canada, New Zealand, India, France, and Poland fighting the Germans at Monte Cassino. Father Ted's mind went back to the painful memories of burying many of his countrymen during the long, brutal battle.
It was my people, the Poles, who were first to the top of Monte Cassino.
The priest thought of how he should end this discussion. Then, after a moment, he spoke.
Ever heard of a crucible?
No?
She said, but it was clear she wanted to know. Ted's hands moved in the air, shaping a deep, invisible bowl. Allison could almost see a great vessel sitting in his large hands.
A crucible is a container used to melt metals together at very high temperatures. It's made to withstand intense heat.
Ali was captivated by the movement of Ted's hands and the sound of his voice.
War is a crucible for men's souls. Men are tossed in, fire is added, and they are changed. Fortunately, most men can find themselves after the crucible. Some, sadly, cannot, but all are changed.
He paused, letting his words sink in. Ali's eyes were fixed on him, hanging on every word.
What about you? You were there.
Yes, I was. But I knew I didn't have to go up the hill. I did not have to face death. Knowing that is an immense difference.
And then, with a smile,
I had God with me. War is a wrenching experience,
Father Ted said, but it was not merely a statement. He hoped the girl understood. In the pause that followed, Allison looked at Father Ted. She realized he was asking her if she got it. Allison had a look of certainty on her face. She got it.
This is why some don't want to talk about it.
As another nod of acceptance appeared on Allison's face, he concluded,
But for those who have been through the crucible of war, family is the best medicine.
He gave her a broad smile and clasped her hands in his. As Father Ted finished speaking, Allie's eyes grew even wider. It had never occurred to her that she was helping her Uncle Dan simply by being there, by being his family. The importance of this settled on her young frame, and she sat in silence,